Okay, so this video is a continuation of the PowerPoint that we started in class on Monday. And so when we left off, we were talking about some of the reforms that the parties have had to undergo, which has led to their overall weakening. So continuing with that, another reform that the parties have had to endure is the primary system. So previously I told you party leaders chose the candidate for nomination for offices, but now primaries have forced candidates to have to go and raise their own money without the assistance of the national committees. And because candidates are now raising their own money and forming their own campaigns without a lot of assistance from the national party apparatus, this has weakened the political parties because now the candidates don't really necessarily need the backing of the party in order to gain support and money from voters. And then previously we had talked about the 1968 McGovern-Fraser Commission that was commissioned shortly after the Democratic National Convention in 1968, which had ended in a riot. And one of the things that they wanted to do to make the conventions more inclusive, the Democrats did, was to require quotas or affirmative action to have a specific number of minorities, women, and young people represented as delegates at the convention. But despite all of these reforms, the parties do endure. Overall, they've been reliable vehicles for mass participation in a representative democracy. They have worked to expand the number of people who are eligible to vote, the types of people who are eligible to vote. They do participate in get out the vote drives. So they are still working to encourage voting participation. They still have remained very competitive with one another. Approximately each party has about 1/3 of the electorate identifies with them, and then the remaining third consider themselves to be independents. But even amongst the independents, most of them have a leaning towards one party or the other. The other thing the parties have done is they have embraced technology, particularly through the internet, has become a huge vehicle for them for fundraising. And this really began in 2004. Howard Dean, who was trying to receive the Democratic nomination for the presidency in 2004, his campaign really revolutionized internet fundraising. For the first time, supporters were able to go to a candidate's website and donate 5, 10, 20, even $1. And so he was really able to raise a lot of money that way. And even President Obama in 2008 and 2012, the vast majority of his campaign donations came in the form of $20 online donations. So it really allows more and more people to be able to participate and show support for their candidate. The party organizations have had to transform, mainly through the embracement of the use of technology, as I mentioned a couple seconds ago. Overall, Republicans tend to outraise the Democrats for campaign money, typically because they just have more well-off donors who have those types of large donations available. Although that is changing, the Democrats actually have an edge on internet fundraising, and so they have been able to close the gap and also exceed Republican spending in the last couple elections. They've also used mail solicitation lists. So if you have ever donated to a candidate, you will go on a list and you will be solicited for the rest of your life. Of course, using the internet, using tracking polls to track how the candidates are doing with different groups, and also grassroots organizations. So the national parties are finding that by creating local organizations at the grassroots level, they're able to mobilize voters better. All right, so these are some of the criticisms of the parties. First, that they evade the issues. Of course, because parties are made up of big interest groups forming large coalitions, they don't want to take very hardline specific stances on issues because that could alienate other voters. And if you've ever watched a news program or interview in which a politician is trying to, get nailed down to a specific answer on a question, it's very difficult to do. Another criticism is that they have no new ideas. It's the same people in office, the same people making decisions, and they're not approaching problems or issues from different vantage points. They pander to special interests, meaning that because campaigns are getting so expensive, parties and candidates are having to rely more on interest groups for money by basically selling their votes for these campaign funds. Failure to deliver on promises. Very often you hear candidates and parties promise all of these great things that they'll do once they get elected to office, but then once they're elected to office, they're not able to deliver on these promises, and that they're corrupt, that they spend and raise money illegally, and that they're not very responsive to the people. So the functions of parties, first and foremost, their main function is to mobilize support and gather power. So they gather power by winning elections, and they win elections by mobilizing support, appealing to voters, and getting out the vote. And getting out the vote is really important because you can have all the supporters in the world, but if they don't show up on election day, you're not going to be very successful. And this was one of the things that the Obama campaign was able to do very well in 2012. And one of the reasons why for the most of toward the end of the election, many people felt Romney was going to win is because many people underestimated the grassroots and ground campaigns that the Obama administration had. Literally armies of volunteers willing to go door to door, drive people to the polls, and make sure that they get out to vote. Parties have also been a force for stability. We've had two parties since our inception, the Democrats and the Republicans. Although we've had some realignments, which I'll talk about in a couple minutes, for the most part, the Democrats and the Republicans have stayed pretty steadfast on their issues. They provide unity. Of course, being a part of a party, knowing that you are like-minded with the other people in your parties and you share the same values. We talked previously that they're a linkage institution. They link the people to the government. Okay, and they can also hold government officials accountable by making sure that they are representing their party's beliefs. Electioneering, this is getting out the vote. Okay, so voter registration drives, providing transportation on election day. They provide a voting and issue queue. So in the last unit, we talked about how party identification was the #1 factor in determining someone's vote. So with all other information being absent, if a voter goes to the polls and knows that they're a Republican, they can feel very safe by just voting for Republicans on the ballot and know that they're probably choosing people that feel the same way on issues that they do. And then, of course, policy formation and promotion. They do this through the National Party Platform, which is constructed at the National Nominating Convention every 4 years. And like I said, you can go on the party's websites and look at the platform. It's just a document that states every possible issue that may be facing the United States in the next 4 years and how the party plans to address those issues. All right, so how does the party operate in government? Well, obviously, we have 3 branches of government, so I'll go through each one so that you can kind of get a sense of what the party's responsibilities are in each of those areas. So the party in Congress is very crucial. Parties select leaders and make committee appointments. So if you are the majority party, a majority of all of the committees, a majority of all the people on the committees in Congress are members of the majority party. So that has huge implications for legislation. Clearly, bills are going to favor the majority party's preferences. The minority party also gets to select its leaders too, but they have very little power. They help to organize and operate Congress. Like I said, everything comes down party lines. Even office space is assigned based on party. They also create deputy and assistant whips. The assistant whips are supposed to whip their party members into line, making sure that they are voting with the party, especially on very important votes where it's important that party unity be maintained. The majority party generally holds most of the power, especially in the House of Representatives, and party discipline is extremely important, especially on a divisive issue. Party discipline, though, in recent years has been kind of hurt by the individualistic nature of U.S. politics. So because more and more candidates more and more elections are candidate-centered, candidates are going to be a little bit more likely to break from their party if they know an upcoming vote is favored by their constituents. Their constituents obviously are the people that hold them accountable. So sometimes you may have individual members tell their party leaders, hey, I can't vote with you because I'm going to be in trouble back home. And so that happens from time to time. But as you can see from the chart on this slide here, party voting has increased quite a bit since the 1970s. And so you can see that's going to make it a little bit more difficult to be able to compromise. And you've seen that especially in the last several years, particularly in the Obama administration. Republican Party voting has been very strong against a lot of the president's policies, and has even led to the shutdown of the government and the default on the debt ceiling on several occasions. All right, so the party in the White House. So the president is the informal head of the party. You know that each national organization, the RNC and the DNC, have an elected chairperson. But if the president is of your party, the chairperson will kind of take a back seat to the president's lead. The president's successes and failures do translate onto the party for better or for worse. So if the president is doing well, his party will do well, and vice versa. Congressional support. The president will rely on members of his party in Congress for support. So if he's wanting to push through a particular piece of legislation, he expects all of the members of his party in Congress to vote with him and to support him. And that's going to be reciprocated. If Congress supports presidential preferences, the president will then support members of Congress of his party by campaigning for them, or making sure that they're getting packages or contracts that will go back home to help their district. The party in the judicial branch, not really a prominent factor because, of course, judges are supposed to be neutral and unbiased. However, judges are creatures of the political process, meaning they are appointed by the president, who's, of course, a member of a party, and confirmed by the Senate, who, of course, are all members of parties. And so they do take the judges', leanings and biases into consideration. But once in office, judges are supposed to be neutral. They're not supposed to have any overt political activity that's kind of frowned upon. The parties in the state governments. So the national parties are the dominant forces. They run the presidential election as well as the quarterly, or not quarterly, but every 4 years, the national nominating convention. But state parties are also very powerful and run independently of the national parties. Governors do have a bit more patronage power at the state level than the president does at the national level because of the civil service reforms that were put in place after Garfield's assassination. You don't have the same civil service reforms at the state level. So the governor is a more powerful party figure. And you do see more party unity or party voting at the state level, especially in state legislatures. Okay, and then the party amongst voters. So amongst voters, the party is represented by an individual's party identification. And so party identification is a person's affinity for a political party. So if you are a Republican, then your party identification is Republican. And that's going to be expressed by your tendency to vote for candidates of the party that you identify with. And so party ID comes from a number of places, mainly, of course, your parents, historical events. You have tons of New Deal Democrats, for example, or Reagan Democrats in the 1980s. So events or people can, inspire party identification. And personalities of candidates, too. If they're particularly charismatic, like Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, he had a number of Democrats vote in support for him in his 2 elections. So in this chart here, you can kind of see the party identification of the American electorate and those trends over the years. They've become pretty close. Like I said, Democrats have about a third of the electorate, Republicans about a third. And then independents, those claiming to be independent, are also about a third. So pretty competitive in terms of the electorate. The fight in any given election is always to get the independents on your side. And basically whichever party wins a majority of the independents is going to win the election. So group affiliation. So all of these factors tend to influence someone's party identification, geographic region. Of course, the South and the West tend to be Republican, and then the Northeast and the Midwest and California, for example, tend to be more Democrat. And that goes back to history and tradition. Of course, the South being more of the Bible Belt. In the Northeast, you have more urban areas, which are going to tend to have more minorities and different income levels. And so that's going to cause them to be more liberal. You also have more union workers. So that will cause them to be more liberal voters as well. Gender, women are slightly more likely to be liberal, of course, because they tend to be caregivers, especially single moms will tend to be more liberal because they may rely on more government assistance. Race and ethnicity, so whites are more likely to be Republican, and then African Americans and Hispanics tend to be more Democrat, except for Cubans. They're kind of the outlier. They usually tend to be pretty conservative. So age, the older you get, the more likely you are to be conservative. Winston Churchill once said, if you're not liberal when you're young, you don't have a heart. And if you're not conservative when you're old, you don't have a brain. Social and economic factors. So the more money you make, the more likely you are to be conservative. But the more education you have, the more likely you are to be liberal. Religion, you're Protestants, Republican. Your Catholics kind of split, Democrat and Republican, and Jews are almost all Democrat. Marital status, single people are more likely to be Democrats. And ideology, of course, if you're liberal, you're going to be a Democrat, and if you're conservative, you're going to be a Republican. So we're going to end here talking about party realignments and de-alignments. So a party realignment is a sharp, lasting shift in the popular coalition supporting one or both parties. So what this means is that there is some factor that causes a large group in one party to shift their support to another party. Usually that results in a change in the issues. So I have the 5 most noted realignments that we've had throughout our history. So in 1800, you have the Democratic Republicans defeating the Federalists. Of course, they were led by Jefferson. The Federalist Party actually dies, and many of the Federalist supporters actually become Democratic Republicans. In 1828, of course, you have the common man Jacksonian Democrats come to power, and so you have a shift in the electorate for the Democratic Party and their champion of, kind of the common man at the expense of the elite. In 1860, the Whig Party actually dies, and of course, Lincoln's Republicans win and would continue to win for quite a while. 1896, the Republicans defeat the populist movement and William Jennings Bryan. And in 1932, of course, FDR Democrats come to power, and many people who had once supported the Republican Party now found themselves to be New Deal Democrats. So in those 5 elections, what you see is large numbers of the electorate actually changing their party identification. And in order for it to be a realignment, it has to be a lasting shift. So this doesn't mean that someone was a Republican and they became a Democrat for just that election. This means large numbers of the electorate actually change their party affiliation permanently and continue to vote that way. And usually it's either a figure or an issue that causes that change. So there's a couple different types of realignments. As you can see, the major party disappears and is replaced, and so that happened in 1800. As well as 1860, or what you can see are voters shifting from one party to another, and that occurred in 1896 and 1932, and also 1828. So here's a map to kind of show you, visually represent, what a realignment looks like. So you can see in the election of 1828, Jackson is, of course, represented in kind of the darker blue. And then you have Adams in the darker blue, kind of greenish there. So you can see a big shift from the election of 1824 to the election of 1828 in terms of support for the candidates. And then in 1860, at the bottom there, you can see the results of the election. Lincoln is in that greenish. Of course, Stephen Douglas in the orange, Breckinridge in the aqua, and then Bell in that kind of neutralish tan color. And so if you were to look at the election of 1856, you can see how larger portions of the country, shifted from one party over to the Republican Party. And then finally here you can see the elections of 1896 and 1932. 1932 being, of course, the best case if you were ever asked a realignment question on the AP exam, like in a free response section. Using 1932 would be your best bet. You can see here how virtually the entire country voting for FDR in 1932. But if you looked at the election of 1828, you obviously see quite a bit of support for Hoover and the Republican Party. So 1932 starts to signal the shift of Republicans to permanently voting for the Democratic Party. And then the last thing we'll talk about here is what's called a party de-alignment. So a de-alignment occurs when party members who have been loyal to one of the two major parties now decides to become independent or unaffiliated with his or her party. And so there's a few reasons why this happens. They may become angry at the policies of the party. They don't like the shift that they've taken on issues. They want to vote for the candidate, not the party. So they want to assess each candidate for who they are as individuals and see what they have to bring to the table and not just let party label determine their vote. This also leads to split ticket voting. So people who tend to not be strongly affiliated with one party or the other will be more likely to split their ticket or vote for one person for one office of one party and vote for another candidate of another party for a different office later on in the ballot. So it would be like me voting for a Democratic governor and then a Republican senator. And that will occur more frequently as more and more people are declaring themselves to be independent of the Republican or Democratic parties. And so you can see the figure, 19% of the electorate considered themselves to be independents in 1958, and that number is now up to about 40% in 2000. And the graphic at the bottom shows you the split ticket voting for the president and the House of Representatives. So in red, you see people who have voted for a Republican president but a Democrat for House. And then in blue, you see the number of people who voted for a Democrat for president but Republican for member of the House of Representatives. And you can see how that number is increasing and even tapering off a little bit in recent years. But it has been quite an issue as more and more people kind of get upset with the parties.